So wonderful to have such a nice crowd of people joining us to talk about such an important topic. My name is Perry LaRock. I'll give you some more introductions in a second. Heather Sheridan, who's the director of Oak and Ivy, is also on the call. Just really glad that we have this many people here. And I know that there's a lot of people who wanted the recording, which is why we're scrambling to figure out why suddenly Google Meet is telling me I can't record, but I can't figure it out. So I also have my phone going next to me here, which will be watch it. Yeah, I appreciate everyone taking the time and let's just jump into it. We have about an hour here, and I'm hopefully going to have some time for some questions at the end. And great. Go ahead and share my screen here. Again, if you want, as I mentioned in the email, feel free to have your cameras on or off. It is totally fine with me how you want to do it. If you have questions and you want to ask them, while we're chatting, feel free to put it into the into the chat, and we'll get there. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end. So. Again, thank you for coming. So my name is Perry LaRock. A little background on me. We moved to London about 2 years ago. We were living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then Burlington, Vermont. We absolutely love it here. We've got an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And so that is also known as an executive functioning hot mess of kids. They're spirited, which is another way of saying they're all hyper. And so I get a lot of daily practice on executive functioning like the rest of you, and am always in a place where I feel like I can be doing much, much better than I am. So I started off my career as a teacher. I was a special education teacher, worked for about 3 years in the public schools, and then I went to work at a psychiatric hospital for children as a teacher there, and then went on to do my doctorate in education with a focus on special education. After that, I taught as a professor training future special educators for about 7 years, and then left academia because it was boring, and I, like my kids, inspirited and need more activity in life. And so I started my own company called Mansfield Hall in the US, and it's a residential college support program for students who are on the autism spectrum, so spectrum-ish. So college capable kids who need some extra support around independent living, social skills, academic skills, vocational skills. And so they're sort of all live within a super dorm, and we call it the super dorm, and then they go to one of the local colleges in their area. So they come back to us every night, and we work with them on homework and emotional regulation and stress tolerance. And so that program is in Burlington, Vermont, Madison, Wisconsin, and Eugene, Oregon. We started a college coaching program about 4 or 5 years ago, right around the pandemic, as it makes sense. So we're working with kids all across the US and some international students on just the executive functioning side of college and helping students sort of holistically approach their and so that's been lovely. And so I manage all of that from the US or from London in the US, and decided that it was time to bring it into London. A lot of that, it has to do with the fact that we're seeing, overall seeing a lot of need for students to get this extra level of support. And they're not getting it explicitly taught in schools, even though we know so clearly that executive functioning support is a huge predictor of college success. It's a huge predictor of life success. I always use the example of, we all can think of the sort of absent-minded professor, people who are very, very, very smart, who, when it comes to putting everything together, it's where they really become more challenged. And so, being able to offer this to students in London, knowing that in many cases, we look for solutions for our students, and we look at tutoring and counseling and therapy, and really what they need is an executive assistant / executive coach. Yeah, we started that this past summer. What you'll get to know about me is that I'm one of those people who will come up and say right off the bat that I know what to do, but I'm terrible at doing it. And I'm assuming that we're all in that same boat as families, that we have a good sense of what needs to be done, what consequences need to be followed through on. And at the end of the day, when it comes to actually doing it, we get caught up in the day-to-day grind and the difficulty with life getting in the way, and the fact that sometimes when we're needing to be at most present with our students is when we're the most tired. And so I am not perfect at any of this. In fact, I was spending a good hour last night with my oldest, coming up with a homework plan of homework that he's gotten behind on. And I was trying to do my best of not just yelling at him and saying, stop being lazy and get it done, and use some of the actual strategies and supports that I know how to use. And it is just such a challenge when you're working with your own kids. And I go back to this idea of, I couldn't teach my kid. The kids were raised, the two youngest were raised in Vermont. And so we were right by the mountains. And I thought I was gonna be able to teach James how to ski. And it's impossible. I just couldn't do it. And it was like, as soon as I had someone else teach him how to ski, he learned it like a day. And you start to realize like those skills that you possess and how much different it is when you're working with someone who's not your child versus your own child. And so I'm bringing this all up because I understand the challenge behind this. I understand that what we're going to do here for the next hour is to talk about executive functioning skills. And by no means am I promising anybody that you're going to walk out of this thing knowing exactly what to do. My hope is that through this conversation, we can start talking about what are the nuts and bolts, what's the big picture of the direction we're trying to go. And so when you leave this, you have the things to think about. And so that you're able to start looking at this from a different perspective and start to make some of those plans that need to be done with your kids. And so we'll talk a lot about that. But there are no magical solutions in this, unfortunately. So you can log off if you thought there was going to be some magical solutions to executive functioning. But I'll just be honest with you that there is no magic solution. It's just a lot of hard work. So let me go here. So I have to start with this. If you've seen me speak before, if you've talked with me before, you'll know that I'm big on this. And I'm big on this idea of the fact that we become obsessed with pathologizing, because I think that we've lost the forest. We've lost the trees in the forest, more accurately. And what's happened is that we've started to rely on dictating service by labels and not by characteristics. And we're more curious with what we call a cluster of symptoms than what the systems entail. And I'll give you an example. A mother that I've been working with for the longest time was really interested in doing this autism screening for her daughter. And we've been working with her daughter for a long time, and she didn't come with a specific autism diagnosis, but we knew her really well, and mom knew her really well, and we knew all of the characteristics of the student, and we knew all of the different details and the strengths and challenges and all those different pieces. She knew her social communication deficits. We knew all of this. And she was working with a neuropsychologist in order to look at a possible autism diagnosis, which I had no problem with. And so she went, and sure enough, she found out that her daughter was technically labeled as mild autism. And I said, so what did we learn? And the answer was, well, we learned that we can attach another word to her diagnosis, but we haven't learned anything new about her, because everything that we've known about her, we already knew. that the important details that we have about your daughter, all these different pieces, we've already really become accustomed with. And so the way we would approach working with her daughter doesn't change at all. In fact, her daughter, before the autism diagnosis and after the autism diagnosis, didn't change whatsoever. She was who she was. And a lot of times when we see kids going through a system and we want to have a diagnosis, we see, like ADHD is a great example, where we start to be concerned. We see that kids are having troubles with executive functioning. They're losing things. They're disorganized. They have a hard time paying attention in class. They need constant reminders, all those other pieces. And we say, well, let's go do this ADHD diagnosis. And sure enough, we find out, okay, yes, the student does qualify for ADHD. There's nothing a practitioner, or at least a good practitioner, can do with just those 4 letters. What we really need to understand is, what is it about their ADHD, or what is it about their neuro diversity that's going to allow us to actually help improve them? And so oftentimes just having this label alone doesn't help us figure out what's going on next. And I'm going to give you some more examples about that and why it's important for us to think about when we're getting into executive functioning. But part of the reason behind this webinar series is because we talk about big things a lot. We talk about executive functioning skills as if it were one thing, or we talk about self-determination as if it were one thing. But when we as practitioners and as researchers dig more into those, what we consider to be concepts, like bigger ideas, we know that they're made up of individual constructs, or things that actually contribute to the overall concept. And so, like a diagnosis, our ability to break down that concept into specific constructs gives us a better sense of how can we help that student. Think about my little guy's home with a fever right now. If we really wanted to dig into why he has a fever, or why he would have a fever for several days, we're not just going to say diagnosis is a fever. That's not his diagnosis. The diagnosis is that there are some specific things going on that is causing that fever to show up. So what is causing the ADHD to show up? What is causing the autism to show up? And then that is what's really going to guide our approach to working with that individual student, not the label, not the symptom. This characteristics approach, this is when I work with teachers, I often say to teachers that the most important information that we have about a student is their characteristics, everything about them. And you can't just work with a student without understanding what they like and what they don't like, what motivates them, what demotivates them, what makes them frustrated, what makes them angry, what's their favorite sport, what kind of music they like. I mean, all of those pieces, because teaching is about building relationships. And we really can't understand a student's full profile unless we truly work to understand who they are as an individual. And the qualities of that person, both strengths and challenges, are equally important for us to understand. How do we take the individual in front of us and match our style of, match our approach to the person that they are? And when we talk about a person-centered approach, when we talk about individualizing in education, what we're not talking about doing is doing separate work. What we're doing is doing work that is tailored for that individual student based on the strengths that they have and based on the challenges they have. And we can't know those things unless we get this full picture of this student who's sitting in front of us. And that is incredibly important. And so again, another way of saying, if your son, daughter, child has a diagnosis, if you've joined us because you're new to the ADHD world, the least helpful thing for us to know about your son or daughter is that they have ADHD. The most helpful thing for us to know about is, how does their ADHD interact with their daily life? And how can we make sure that we're streamlining who they are, the amazing, awesome person they are, into the person that they want to be? And that takes creativity. That takes really knowing a student. That takes patience. That takes our ability to constantly reassess the plan and come up with new plans and continue to be creative. There is no silver bullet for any one of these things. There's no silver bullet or the way we learn. It's just that we have to be more creative when we have a complex learning profile. One thing that I still think is one of the biggest, oxymorons in public education is that we know that public or private education in general, is that we know that when we look at ADHD, just in particular, when we look at ADHD, we know that generally about 50% of CEOs running major corporations making billions of dollars across the world report as either thinking they have ADHD or have a diagnosis of ADHD. And so what we treat in schools as this huge deficit and almost like a nuisance ends up becoming something that can work really well in people's favors if they are matched with the environment that they are in. And so again, how can we think of ADHD as a disability when we're trying to teach students to become CEOs, but think of it as a strength once they become one? And so again, we see this mismatch with the way that we're thinking about this, the way that we're treating it, and we're looking at it as these are deficits and not diversities. And I think that that is a big thing for us to realize, is that the reason why we think of these things as deficits is because they don't fit in correctly to the environment that we put these kids within. This is your job as a parent. This is one of my favorite little gifts that I've found. That's your student. They're the square block, and that's the school and society. They're the round hole. And this is really what, when we have complex learning profiles, when we have unique learning characteristics, what we're seeing is that we as parents are trying to bash that student into that hole. And what we're losing are those amazing corners, right? Those are the pieces that we're starting to lose and stifle, that the students are really needed for this amazing life that they're headed towards, with these great set of characteristics that can be really advantageous to them. We don't want them to lose that. But on the other hand, we're trying to fit them into this system. And just recently I was talking to a mom in the pickup line, and we were talking about how her son is can be really like argumentative and sassy and talking back and all these other things. I said, the complex thing that we're doing as parents right now is we have this list of qualities we want to see out of our kids. We want them to be independent. We want them to be critical thinkers. We want them to question information. We want them to be collaborators. We go down this list of things that we want our kids to become. And those are skills in which they make for really difficult kids to raise. Critical thinkers who are going to question, wait, why does that make any sense, mom or dad? Or people who are wanting to be more independent than what we might have been when we were kids. And so they're seeking more independence than they had in the past. And how do we balance that? And so in some ways, when we're putting them into this industrial model of education and wanting them to be independent in a system that is not necessarily created for independence, we're seeing that mismatch. There's this amazing article in the New York Times that came out in April. If you haven't read it, I can send it. And it really challenged the paradigm of ADHD. And there are some big takeaways from that and if you're curious about medication, all the different pieces, some amazing takeaways. They really did a good job of bringing all the literature together. But one of the pieces that I thought really resonated throughout, and something that as a teacher and something that as a practitioner and researcher and professor that I have been saying for many, many years, is that what we do so often is create disability. Like what we're actually doing is we're creating the situations in which we're handicapping our students. And part of what the article had looked at was, if you look at ADHD, we often find that this is oftentimes much more present when we have this environmental mismatch. When we start to take the kinds of skills a student with ADHD has and put them into an environment where those skills aren't celebrated, we start to see those ADHD characteristics go way up. So if you have a kid who struggles with executive functioning or attention or impulse control, put them into that, if we put them into that situation where they are now needing to maintain their focus for long periods of time, that we're going to see that they have ADHD. I mean, it is like, oh, okay, yeah, like you're disabled. This would be like putting a person, and I have a slide for this, but putting a person in a wheelchair below a set of stairs, being like, oh, yep, they're disabled. It's like, well, yeah, because you put them in front of a set of stairs. It's the same thing, that we really start to see these things actually come out a whole lot more when the ADHD is mismatched with the environment. And in fact, in some ways, what some of these studies are suggesting is that if you put these kids in their right environment, we actually don't see this thing called ADHD to the extent that we're seeing it in a school where we have high expectations, demands for the students to be learning in a particular way. Going back to this idea of, and I like to share this, what you'll see from this presentation, and then if you join us for the next two, is that I like to think about when I'm working with students, and you look at like the 100+ students that we have at Mansfield Hall, sometimes people will be like, so they all have autism? And I'll say, no. In fact, only about 30% of them have an autism diagnosis. They say, oh, well, that's weird. I said, yeah, but they all have executive functioning disabilities. They all have executive functioning challenges. Because when we start to look at like individual skills, like going back to this characteristics approach, it doesn't matter what the big name for it is, it matters how those things are impacting them. And so when we start to think about executive functioning as the lens today that we're going to talk through, because we can do the same lens for self-determination, we can do the same lens for resilience, we start to look at what are the skills that make up that overall concept. So what are the skills that make up this idea of executive functioning, and how might a profile, how might an autism profile, an ADHD profile, or a dyslexia profile contribute to deficits within this area of executive functioning? And we see, of course, we see a huge amount of overlap, but we also see that some of them can trend, for example, like at autism, where we start to see in the areas of emotional regulation and social communication, that specific executive functioning still tends to be more challenging for people with autism. Doesn't mean it always is. But we also see that they could also be struggling from flexibility or emotional regulation or processing speed, or none of those. And what they're really struggling with is working memory and inattention and impulsivity, right? And so in some ways, that the idea that we're looking at from this lens is, okay, let's throw out the diagnosis. Let's take a moment to really look at our individual student, and let's be the doctors involved and try to figure out what is the underlying cause of their struggle. The symptom is not important. The symptom gives us a sense that something's going on. It's the actual it's the actual mechanisms that are creating that symptom is what's important, because we can't just treat a fever. We can treat the symptom of a fever, right? We can do all the homework for them, but we can't necessarily stop the fever unless we understand what's causing it. That's the exact same thing when we start thinking about executive function. We can't necessarily help someone with autism until we know what about their autism, what about their ADHD, what about their complex learning profile is it that's causing the symptom of frustration or low homework skills or not reaching their potential. Let's figure that piece out, and let's address that and focus on it and dig down more into it. I have to bring this up because I was just at the school. I was at the American School this morning and was having this conversation, and this is really a much bigger idea, and it's something where I want us all to be on the same page on, because we're not on the same page on this. I'm going to have a hard time telling you what to do next. And that is what we do as parents and teachers, right? Like what we teach, right, is not nearly as important as how the student learns. And this is something that has gone past the wayside of when we think about how we're educating our kids. It's not about how a teacher teaches. It's about how a student learns. And I can't say that enough, that we can have the quote unquote best teaching model on the entire planet, but it's not going to work for all the students in our class. And so therefore it's an ineffective teaching model. The best teaching model is for us to understand how a student is learning, how a student learns, and help adapt how they're receiving that information for the best way for them to learn. And so things like universal design for learning, where the focus is on creating an expert learner, the idea here for us is not necessarily to figure out what plan that we want to implement is going to work for our son, daughter, or child. What we want to make sure is that we understand how our son or daughter or child is learning and help them figure out how to do it on their own. This is a problem, and I mean, go back to college. This is the professor who says to you, well, this is how I teach, and it's up to students to figure out how to learn it. And that's not like, if a professor says that to you, professors still say this, by the way. I work with 12 different universities, and they still say it all the time. It's not my job to make sure students learn. It's my job to teach, which is just shows that here just disconnect between the idea that teaching should be inspiring learning. And if your teaching's not inspiring learning, then what you've done is you've missed the idea that what you're doing is, the outcome of what you're doing is the most important piece. And we have, when we get into this learning concept, and this could be another future webinar series, when we get into this learning concept, when we have students who have these unique learning profiles, we know that just breaking this concept of learning down into its subparts, the learning is actually really complex. And what we've all done is taken it for granted. And now when we think about your kids at school right now, they're doing all of this all at the same time, all day long. And if they have a weakness in any one of those things, they're trying to figure out how to get around it. And so in some ways, they are the students are the ones that are actually having to learn in a class. A teacher is there to hopefully be there to provide lots of opportunities, lots of activities, lots of engaging and activities and assignments, right? Those are all that opportunity. But at the end of the day, it is up to the individual learner to be able to put all these pieces together. And so, quite frankly, in the first book I wrote, I have a chapter called "We Can't Do It For Them," because we just can't. What we have to do is we have to be able to we have to be able to empower our kids to do it for themselves. And that goes right along with the executive function. It goes with everything in education. We have to get them to figure out, how am I empowered as a learner to understand my strengths, to understand my weaknesses, to understand how I learn, the best ways for me to learn. What do I need as a learner to be most successful? It's not up to, oh, my teacher sucks, and therefore I'm not going to learn anything. No, it's up to you as the individual. How are you going to do it? Someone just the other day told me that they were in a class, and in that class, they finally realized that the professor was bad enough that they were going to have to do it all on their own. And that's that sort of mentality. When you're in college, we get to that point where we're like, oh God, this professor's horrible. I'm going to have to do extra reading. I'm going to have to watch YouTube. I'm going to have whatever those is to supplement the bad lecture there is. But there's a certain number of those kids in the class being like, well, the professor sucks, so I didn't learn anything, which is the exact, I was sort of that learned helplessness of like, if someone's not making me learn, I'm not going to be able to learn, versus like, this is an opportunity for me to learn and I have to understand the opportunity in front of me. So this is all of us, I suppose, right now, as good helicopter parents. And I want to, right off the bat, I want to say, I'm not against helicopter parenting. I'm for really good flights. I'm for really good controls. And I think that in this day and age, all kids need a good helicopter parent that is understanding what the outcomes of their helicoptering should be. And if you have a child with a diagnosis, a child with a disability, then I would say that they are not going to succeed unless you take this role. That the amount of advocacy and work that is required to get them back to what they deserve isn't going to happen unless you're there making sure that it's happening. And so when we start to see this, negative connotation of a helicopter parent, I say, hey, listen, I've got 150 kids at Mansfield Hall this year with extraordinarily complex learning profiles who all made it to this point because mom and dad never allowed the word no to take over. They continue to push. They continue to look for solutions. They continue to look to push schools to do better. They continue to show up to webinars to understand what they could be doing at home. That this couldn't have been done, in the world of just letting it, letting it happen by itself. What we're not going for as helicopter parents is being in a situation where we see kids who have this failure at a launch, that we become enabling, that we have this extended adolescence, that they move to your basement. Like this is like what people don't realize is that really bad helicoptering means that what you've done is you've created a totally helpless 18-year-old. And now they go off to college and they actually fail out because you were so about making sure that your son or daughter was on track at all times that you forgot about the most important person to be on track at all times was your kid, not you. That you're really good at this, you're really good at being their executive assistant because that's what we were having children to do, is be their executive assistants. But at what point do we start to look at how are we taking our job as the helicopter pilot to start to empower our kids to transfer these skills? There's this whole idea of moving, and again, I'm going to share this presentation with everybody, and so don't worry about trying to read everything. But there's this idea of like the most challenging thing that we're going to do as a parent is move from being a manager to a mentor, and it is extraordinarily difficult. Everyone says, my wife, Emily, is a doctorate level clinical psychologist. And people are like, oh, you guys just must be so good at home. And if you came into our house, I think everyone would be like, holy cow, I'm not taking any advice from you whatsoever. Because it's such a hard thing to do when emotion and reality sets in and you have 11-year-olds screaming and crying at you with their new braces and being mad at you for something that you have nothing to do with. And in those moments, how do we start to switch from this idea of like, I'm going to manage your life to I'm going to help mentor you through your problems? And so collaborative problem solving is a great approach. If you haven't looked into it, it is absolutely 100% worth reading more about it, watching some YouTube videos on it, because it really does reframe this idea of two pieces. One is that it's skills, not will, skill, not will. So that means that it's not that your kids don't want to do things. No kids are lazy. They just don't have the skills in order to follow through. So it's a skill-based approach. What skills need to be focused on? How do we improve those skills? And the other is that it's not us versus them. It's us together. And so we're sitting on the same side of the table, looking at the same problem, and we're talking through how do we solve this problem and how do I start to empower students to do that over time? And so, we start to look at this idea of manager, and kids don't like that. You know how it goes. When you tell your kids what to do, that's when you get the pushback. And so when we're dealing with things that kids aren't good at, and we're trying to help them with them, we have a layer of defensiveness because you're their parent, and then we have another layer of defensiveness that they're not good at it. And so now we're trying to break through to the things that they're not good at as their parent. And unless we have this really good mentor model that what we're really trying to do is be on your side to help you solve these problems so that you can do this on your own eventually, and they see you in that way, then we're never going to get as far with them as that we want. And quite frankly, this is why a lot of people end up outsourcing executive functioning support, because like I did with skiing, it's just way easier for me to pay someone to teach my kids how to ski than for me to have multiple temper tantrums on the side of a mountain. And then carrying, a 3-year-old over my shoulder down the mountain with my ski boots on. And so, this is one of those pieces again, where I'm terrible at this. Like I have to stop. I have to leave the room, take 400 deep breaths, come back in and try to start over all the time. Moving from manager to mentor is not easy. And so again, this is our shining light. This is where we want to go. This doesn't mean that when we're done with this call, you're gonna be like, oh, honey, I learned how to be a mentor today and stop being a manager. No, you're going to go right back to being a manager. But as you're being a manager, every time you're being the manager, can you think to yourself, how can I start doing this in a way? How can I have this conversation today from the mentor perspective and not the manager perspective. And maybe the next 10 you have in a row are yelling at your kid to get out the door and don't forget their lunch, like I do. But then when you have that opportunity to again go, oh yeah, I'm working on being more of a mentor and not the manager. What does that look like, and how can I do that? And so this is a goal that we have. Will we ever get there? From my sister, who's much older than me, it sounds like she wasn't able to be a mentor to her kids until they were all over the age of 25. And so maybe this is something that we have to really hope eventually it comes back to favor us. But it is one of those things where we're constantly striving for it. This idea of whose responsibility is it for learning? Again, I point this out to teachers and professors all the time, because if someone comes to me and says, hey, Teddy, he showed up to preschool today, but he just didn't seem interested in learning. And listen, I can't help him learn unless he shows up here ready to learn. And so he didn't do anything today because I'm here to teach, not to make sure he's learning. I'd be like, whoa, we need to go to Matt on this one and talk about what that is. Because obviously preparedness for learning is something that we're doing in preschool, kindergarten. We're getting kids ready to be learners. We're creating little learners. And the idea is that over time, what we're hopefully doing is we're taking these students and we're transitioning that responsibility of learning to them. And so we're going to see that as we start to increase in our or decrease our responsibility for their learning, we've hopefully increased their responsibility for learning as well. As Vygotsky called it, this is our scaffolding. This is how we're trying to find that right level of them being able to do it on their own and start to become irrelevant in their lives. I mean, the idea here is independence is that we are somewhat irrelevant in their life when it comes to what they need, right? That's the goal as a parent. Like, Mom, my kid never needs my help. I just get to see them when they're happy and bringing the grandkids over. Not, I have to help my kids solve every problem until the day I die. And so how are we starting to create this pathway where we're starting to hand it off to them? You're joining us from the lower school right now. You've got a long ramp right now. I mean, this is something for you to start looking at over the next, 10 years. For those of you in the upper school that are facing college coming up, if your kid is in a place where they're not taking responsibility for their own learning, not taking responsibility for their executive functioning skills, then the idea here right now is we're seeing red lights going off, big alarms that the most important skills they're going to learn in the next 2 years are taking responsibility for their own learning, understanding their learning profile, and starting to control their own executive functioning. Because when they go to college, no one will do it for them, and you're not there enough to do it for them. Okay, executive functioning. And my assumption is when people join an executive functioning webinar, you already probably know most of it. And I want to talk about two of the most important things to understand with executive functioning. And then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of slides that have a lot of information on them that is meant for you to read later and look back through it. And I'll give some ideas of why that is. But executive functioning, that air traffic control system, right? This is what to do, when to do it, how long to do it, how to maintain my focus while doing it, how to manage my frustration while doing it, how to overcome my challenges in learning, how to get started on something, how to complete something, how to map it out so I'm not overwhelmed, right? This is all of those skills put together. And this is again, when someone's like, oh, they have executive functioning challenges, it doesn't tell us anything. Because when we start to break down, and this is just not even the full list, if you go on, you start to see self-advocacy put on an executive functioning list, social skills put on an executive functioning list, impulse control, is that on this one? Yep, impulse control. But you'll see that depending on what book you read or what person is presenting, this list is going to change because there are a lot of skills that are involved in the process of how one learns, right? This is from the beginning to end. And understanding what is it that they're struggling with in any one of these areas is so incredibly important. Because one is that there's this idea of if one, then all. And meaning that if a student is struggling in one area and they don't have the support for it, it tends to kind of be like an avalanche. And it kind of starts to cloud all the other areas. And probably the best example of that is emotional regulation. Emotion regulation, and we'll get to this, all the skills that it takes to manage your frustration and in order to do boring things, in order to endure difficult things, and all of those pieces that go into emotional regulation. Oftentimes we don't know if emotional regulation struggles are the product of or the what's creating the executive functioning problems, right? So someone can have really poor emotional regulation skills and they get really stressed out and they start to isolate and they start to avoid and do all these other things. Well, of course, planning and organizing and starting tasks and finishing, all of that stuff is going to fail thereafter because they have poor emotional regulation skills. But how many people on this call right now are here because your kid's emotionally stressed out? They're overwhelmed. You're getting in fights with them about their studies. And the question is, are they having poor emotional regulation skills, or is their lack of planning and prioritization causing their emotional regulation challenges? And so we can do this for any one of these categories and understand how they impact all of the rest. And I think that that's where, as you as now the sleuth, as the detective in all of this, is trying to figure out your full understanding of that. What is it that actually, what specific skill or skills are tripping my kid up? And let's focus on those skills, not all of them, but those skills. The hard part of when you do executive functioning support in schools is that they tend to think about planning and prioritizing only, right? We're going to pull out our notebooks, we're going to write it down, we're going to figure it out, we're going to put it all here, and that's it. And that's the idea of like, if we just have it organized or we just have it planned, then everything else will come along with it. But what we know is that some students who have really poor executive functioning skills, they actually have no problem with planning and prioritizing. What they do is they fall apart once they've planned and prioritized, right? These are the task completion kids, like those kids that never turn it in because they either misjudge their time or they have poor emotional regulation to finish it. They get bored with it. They lose attention to it. They have poor self-monitoring. They're not watching all of these different pieces play into it. And so executive functioning skills, just by addressing one category, isn't necessarily, if it's not their category that they're the weakest in, it isn't necessarily going to solve the issue. For some kids, hey, calendar, notebook, Google Calendar, that's all they need. We wouldn't say that person has executive functioning challenges. If a student has executive functioning challenges and all they needed was a good Google Calendar app on their phone, they're crying out loud, just do that, and then the problem is solved, right? Sometimes it's that simple. Sometimes it becomes a lot more complex. And that's where it takes us as a parent to be really curious, to be really, to be the detective, to really look into it and try to identify what is this skill or skills that are most challenging for my kid, and I'm going to focus specifically on those. This is just sort of how, how we're going to always, and this is my homework for everybody, is that what we're going to do always in any intervention that we do, in any approach that we take, we're always going to do this process where we're going to evaluate what the problem is. The problem is not executive functioning challenges, right? That's not the problem. That's the symptom. That's why you're here. That's why you want to learn more. What we want to do is we want to figure out what is it about the executive functioning that's the problem. So now let's say we've dug into it, and your kid, their biggest problem is time management, right? That's what you like. Okay, I've realized that they're always getting out the door late. They're never giving themselves enough time for homework. They're always showing up to class late. They didn't give themselves enough time to study, right? It's all like, I'm just seeing this as a total time management problem. Stop there, right? Just stop there. Everyone's going to stop right there, and you're going to pick that one skill for today. And hopefully if you guys join me in a month again, we can talk about this, but you pick that one skill. And if you don't know what it is, maybe you need to talk to a teacher, maybe you need to talk to a counselor, maybe you need to talk to your spouse or your other children and figure out what that is. Maybe you need to talk to your kids. Sorry, I should have started with that, to figure out what that is, right? And we're going to say, okay, there's that one skill. What we're going to do now is we're going to collaborate on a solution to that skill. So let's figure something out. Now, this isn't the way you do things is an important example of how you have adapted your executive functioning skills to your learning preferences. So it's an incredibly important example of how you do things, but it's not how someone else should do things. And that's super important. So you sitting down with your kid and saying, well, this is how I do it, just do it this way, you're managing, you're not mentoring. What you're trying to figure out is, what is it that will work? What will work for you? And the question is what method works the best? Well, the answer is whatever method works the best, right? There's no rocket science behind that. When we see kids who have assignment notebooks and they're not using Google, well, then use assignment notebook. When we see kids with Post-it notes on their mirrors in the morning to remind them to do things, and that works, do that, right? It doesn't matter what kind of sophistication the plan has. In fact, the original idea behind assistive technology when they didn't have computers was how can I button my shirt if I don't have arms and I'm gonna use paper clips and clothespins, right? The idea isn't that the technology has to be excellent. In fact, sometimes adding more technology to a problem actually increases the cognitive load for a kid so they can't actually focus on the challenging areas. But we're gonna try to figure out, now we have time management skills. So what are you going to do? Well, I would say to all of you, if you haven't started using ChatGPT, go to ChatGPT and give a little introduction about your kid and what they're struggling with, and ask it for 10 solutions for that problem. And then go through that list with your child and say, do you think any of these would be helpful? Ask with their teacher, ask Google it, do anything, right? But the idea is that there are a lot of different ways to address any one of these executive functioning skills. It's just a matter of finding a way that your child and you are willing to work together on it, and then integrate that within their daily routine, implement a plan, and monitor. Do that one skill for a while. Just choose that one. Everyone's homework right now is choose the one thing you know that they're bad at. Just one thing. And do this process. And run this for a while and see what else is still struggling. It's very possible that you hit it on the head on the first time and all they needed was a Pomodoro timer to help them with their homework. And oh my God, they're not stressed out anymore. They're doing it just fine. But you might also find out that okay, this is a problem. But now that I've got their time management skills coming up here, I can also see that they're really having a hard time planning and prioritizing. So now, what's the next step you're going to do? Well, let's evaluate what that looks like. What is it? Where are they struggling with their planning and prioritizing? Okay, this is where they're struggling with it. Understand that. Now sit down with your kid and look at all of the different strategies. And again, it doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. It doesn't take much more than a Google search or a ChatGPT question of what are some different strategies that could help my child with planning and prioritizing. And go through that list, not by yourself to choose one, but go through the list with your kid and say, hey, these are some of the things that might be helpful and make you less stressed out. I'm trying to build their intrinsic motivation to solve their problems so they feel less stressed out. And I'm now going to say, let's choose one of these things. Let's create a plan for it. Let's integrate that plan. And hey, my job as the mentor is to be here to help remind you, to help you stay accountable to yourself, to help rework the plan, to help you talk through these things as they move forward. But the idea isn't, I'm going to do all of the executive functioning skills and make a plan for all of them right now, because one, you're going to overwhelm the heck out of your kid. But what you're also going to do is you're not going to figure out actually which one is actually the most problematic. And so when we're coming with this least restrictive approach, the idea is let's figure out what it is. Let's come up with some solutions that we can both stomach. Let's implement the plan, and then let's keep changing it. And let's just keep doing that until it works. This is where the role of a parent requires that magical skill called patience and the understanding that we have, for some of us, we have 10 more years to figure, 7 more years to figure it out. I'm panicking. We have 7 more years to figure this out. And so let's just figure it out. Let's not be stressful about it. The other thing I want to say here is that this presentation isn't going to be worth anything unless you do something, right? And so the commitment, right, to doing something, right? And I'm going to give you an example. Teddy, my K2er, we in the summers, we go back to the US and the kids live on a lake in the middle of absolutely nowhere and basically run around barefoot and mostly clothed for 2 straight months. So the transition back to school is like taking dirty little feral kids and then throwing them back into the American school where they don't fit in at all, after a summer of those 2 months. And Teddy is just like, he's wanting to catch frogs and toads, and we were like, oh my God, we're just struggling with him. We're yelling and we're mad and we're constantly, and finally Emily and I, again, this is where there's no experts at home. We're like, we just need to put a sticker chart back on. We just need a sticker chart. And we're like, oh yeah, let's just get the sticker chart. And we put the sticker, this is after 2 weeks, and we put the sticker chart up, and it's like, Teddy earns, it's so simple too. It's like, Teddy earns a sticker when he does something well. And we just get to use it whenever we want. Some kids need much more structured plan. We're just like, good job eating your breakfast. You get a sticker, you get to pick out a sticker. And then he does it. And all the problems went away. And we're like, why did we spend 2 weeks fighting this kid when in reality it was just this simple? We just needed to be smart, stop, breathe, plan, evaluate, collaborate, integrate, and move on. And so again, this is where, if I can tell you from this presentation, if you can just choose one area, just that one thing, and just work with your kid on that one, you will see progress towards that goal, and it's going to reduce the stress in your household this much more in order to free your time up to start to focus on the next thing. So I want to be clear that I was going to ask this as a question, but in the sake of time, I'm just going to say what the answer probably is for most of us, or maybe it's just me and I'm just bad at being a parent sometimes. Executive functioning challenges for me always show up around level 5. So when James is really struggling with his executive functioning, he's at the peak of his frustration tolerance and anger and avoidance and frustration, all of that, right? Because that's when he comes to me, he's like, I'm not going to do my homework. Homework is stupid. Math is stupid. ASL is stupid. Everything is stupid. And I'm at that moment, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to be the mentor. And he's like, why are you talking to me like that? You sound like an idiot. And I'm trying to work him through his executive functioning challenges. And it's like, even as this practitioner who's worked with kids with severe emotional disabilities, I forget about this fact that no learning happens somewhere between level 3 and 6, right? That when kids start to see that I'm getting frustrated, I'm getting more frustrated, there's a point at which their emotions have now completely shut down their brain. And so the problem with us with dealing with these executive functioning challenges is they come to us at level 5. And now we're trying to do something about it with a kid who's just totally emotionally dysregulated. And so again, this is where we need to go back to that idea of evaluate and plan when they're calm, right? Or when they're recovering. The idea of wow, oh God, you were so stressed out about that assignment. How are you feeling now? Better? Yeah. Well, let's try to avoid that. Let's talk about what can we do to avoid you getting that upset in the future? And this is a great opportunity for us to say, hey, I've been noticing that, blank is happening every time this happens. And can we start to think about some ideas of how we can implement a plan to make that better? Or you come home and say, don't wait for your kid to be all stressed out. You come home and say, hey, I saw this presentation today and I want to just talk about one thing and start to work on a plan for this one little thing in your life, and can you help me with that? Can we work on that together? But at a point when they can be reasonable and calm and work with you on it, the time to teach the executive functioning skills isn't when they're already frustrated about them. So these are the screens where I've got a whole bunch of information here. Again, do I have every tip and strategy for you to take away to help your kid improve emotional regulation? Absolutely not, and I'm not stupid enough to think that I do. I don't know your kids. And that's the first thing that is going to be a problem, is that if I don't know your kids, then I can't tell you what good strategy works, because I have to know what they like and what they don't like. And the second is that this isn't an exhaustive list. And remember, the most important list that we're looking at is what they will do, what they're motivated to do. And so what we're looking at is identifying that area. Is it primarily an emotional regulation? Let's just say one of you now is like, that's my area. Your job is to figure out what part of emotion regulation is tripping them up, where are they getting in trouble, where are they most dysregulated in life, how is that showing up at home, and then try to figure out exactly what are the strategies I need to think about in order to implement into their lives to reduce that feeling of stress and frustration. And so we start to look at all these different skills and strategies and approaches, and the list could go on miles long, but the only one that matters is the one that you and your child can do together. And so start to think of in that sense of like, this isn't about, no one expert is going to tell you exactly what works. They're going to have a lot of ideas. It's up to you and your child to figure out what is the idea that will work best for them. And we go right down the list of task initiation. This is procrastination, right? There are evidence-based strategies for task initiation. If your kid is constantly procrastinating, and that's the skill today that you're going to start focusing on, then do your research, think about how it's impacting them, think about how you're going to approach it with them, and think about, here are the different skills. Here's some right here, 7 or 8 of them, that might be more helpful for you. And let's find one that works. Let's run it for a while and see if it makes things better. If it doesn't, let's go back to the drawing board and look at a different plan and move from there. Organization. Same thinking here is, how are we going to help our students learn to become more organized? And if this is the area of challenge for them, then figure out what are the strategies today that we're going to start doing to help my child be more organized, and just focus on that one. Time management, planning and prioritizing. And again, I go back to this as, this is how I would work with your children, right? If I was their teacher, if I was their coach, the way I'd be working with them is to try to understand who they were, try to understand what's tripping them up in life, try to match my strategy or my intervention with who they are as a person, and something that they're willing to engage and collaborate with me on. Now, you have, as a parent, right? Now we have to add all of the baggage of being a parent. We have to have all the baggage of emotions that are tied to it. And we have to figure out, how can we focus on these specific areas? How can I help identify this? How can I figure out some good strategies for it? And then how can I just do it? And I want to emphasize that just do it. Not to be Nike, steal Nike's phrase, but just do it. You got to start with something. Don't start with everything. Don't be overwhelmed by executive functioning. Choose one thing. Try that one thing and see how it makes a difference, and then continue to evaluate and change as it moves forward. So we're always here to support and help and run ideas by. I'm certainly it's helpful to interpret data. There's you can look back through your neuropsychs if you have them. You can look back through your ADHD assessments if you have them, whatever it is, and start to look at what are those specific areas they're struggling in, and what are the associated strategies that will be good fit for my child. So next month we're talking about self-determination. It is relevant to everybody. It's certainly relevant to upper school, but it's extremely relevant to lower school. And really the idea of self-determination is, how do we create kids who can make good decisions for themselves and start to lead their education and their fields of study and their interest areas for career forward in a way that is that they feel empowered and they have the skills to do so. So it's a whole different set of skills that we're going to look at. We're going to dig deep into the concepts of self-determination. We're going to talk about what are the actual constructs that make up the concept of self-determination, and what are those constructs that we can look at as a parent, and how can we provide specific strategies to our kids to make sure that they're building those skills over the next however many years before they leave our homes. That's it. If people need to go, feel free to head out. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat. I will share all of this with everybody who joined. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to commiserate with all of you as a fellow parent. And I wish you the best of luck in this impossible challenge of helping our kids, and just stick with it. You're not alone. Let me see if we got questions. Sorry, I'm stopping presenting here.